Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am again joined by Right Ruminations. We're here to discuss the history of classical music and I think in a little more detail, a certain response he has to various theories on the development of music. So, why don't you lead us away?
Just to outline the basic arrangement of the history of classical music, in the ancient world, music tended to be monophonic, which means, or rather, monophonic, which means that it uses one line, one melody. Like if you think of somebody singing a song with no accompaniment, and it's very simple, this is the kind of music, what little of it remains, that was written by the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, or the Sumerians. And it is something that doesn't develop much beyond this until medieval Europe, where the practice begins of placing two melodies on top of one another. How this begins to develop is that there is the melody, and then someone else will sing or play the same melody, but at a certain interval higher or deeper, so that they run in parallel to one another. In As things develop into the later medieval period, you have a third line sometimes being added, and then you have melodies that have different rhythms being added and different melodies placed on top of one another, which marks the introduction of something called counterpoint or polyphony, where you actually have different melodies placed on top of one another. And then in the Renaissance, you have the emergence of very complex uses of polyphony, where there are different rhythms, multiple voices, like 4, 5, 6, even more voices being used at the same time. By voices, I mean different musical parts. There are often cases where one line ends after another one has begun in a different part, and then the one that began second continues after the first melody is continued, and it becomes very mathematically complex. And this is in the 15th and 16th century. This is where you get into names like Palestrina, that is Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, Orlando Lassus, and other names that are associated with this particular epoch, to name a few of the more famous ones. It's usually in a style that mimics this era that I tend to compose music myself, and you can find a number of pieces imitating this style on my channel in my music playlist. In fact, one of them is featured on the homepage of my YouTube channel, so you can get an idea of the type of complexity that I'm talking about in the basic style, but also by referencing the composers I mentioned. From the Renaissance, so far here we have two epochs: there's the medieval period and then the Renaissance. Then you have the Baroque period, in which the music becomes more presentation oriented, but just as complex in many ways as the medieval period. And polyphony continues to be used, and also many different types of instrumentation tends to be used, and you basically find the emergence of what you might call symphonic music. In other words, it becomes even further complexified. After the Baroque, and I'm not entirely sure when the Baroque era ends. It begins, I think the formal date for the beginning of the Baroque period is in 1603, early 17th century. The Baroque period then ends with the classical period, which is in the 18th century primarily. And the classical period is kind of like very typically classical music that would be associated with names like Mozart and Haydn, to a lesser extent Beethoven, who comes a bit later. Whereas the Baroque period was characterized by names like Bach and Handel. In the classical period, this movement towards presentation intensifies further, and it often becomes a situation where you have one predominant melody with then symphonic orchestration backing it up. And it becomes much more bourgeois in a sense. It becomes more the kind of stereotype of what you think of with classical music, like operas and symphonies. Then in the 19th century, you pass into something called the Romantic period, which is the period associated with Wagner and Verdi, to name a couple of names, in which it continues in this direction of having often a single melody backed up by fairly complex orchestration. And it also becomes more emotional and more spectator oriented. I think more spectacle in a sense, and involves these depictions of heroic deeds and these very evocative 19th century, almost kind of like, if you want to find a literary equivalent, it's kind of like the musical equivalent in terms of mood of something like Tennyson in his poetry. Then in the 20th century, you obviously have the modern period, at which point it goes in all different kinds of directions, including minimalist music, where there's very little going on in the music, and in the opposite direction, including some very complex devices, where it goes in the opposite direction from minimalism, and it might be described as a kind of maximalism. And then this development of modern classical music is obviously something separate from the development of pop music, in which a lot of what develops is actually more similar to ancient music, in that in pop music, there's more of an orientation towards simplicity and of almost something that could be hummed by one person. And so before we delve into the implications of that, I'd just like to say that that's the basic outline of the history of classical music, that you have these epochs of the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Baroque period, the classical period, the Romantic period, and then finally the modern period, which outline this kind of arc from the very simple to kind of peak in the Baroque period of incredibly complex, and then the curve eventually descends back in the direction of simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is only a minor point, but isn't Beethoven considered romantic?
He is. That's why I said to some extent he is technically romantic, but there's a lot he's early romantic, and there's a lot in him that's very similar to some of the things that you hear in the classical period, just in terms of the form and things of that nature. He's much more on the fence between romantic and classical than, say, Wagner or Verdi.
Yes. Now, the one point that you made that I found very interesting is that modern day music, popular music, is very akin to early or ancient musical forms, because it's simple, it's not complex, and this, in some sense, wasn't an accident. In his 1975 interview of Jimmy Page, William Burroughs writes this: "This Led Zeppelin show depends heavily on volume, repetition, and drums. It bears some resemblance to the trance music found in Morocco, which is magical in origin and purpose, that is, concerned with evocation and control of spiritual forces. In Morocco, musicians are also magicians. Gnawa music is used to drive out evil spirits. The music of Jujuka evokes the god Pan, god of panic, representing the real magical forces that sweep away the spurious. It is to be remembered that the origin of all arts, music, painting, and writing is magical and evocative, and that the magic is always used to obtain some definite result. In the Led Zeppelin concert, the result aimed at seems to be the creation of energy in the performers and in the audience. For such magic succeeded, it must tap the source of magical energy, and this can be dangerous. And he writes also concerning the magic and how this goes back to an earlier form. Since the word magic tends to confuse our thinking, I would like to say exactly what I mean by magic and the magical interpretation of the so-called reality. The underlying assumption of magic is the assertion of will is the primary moving force in this universe. The deep conviction that nothing happens unless something or someone wills it to happen. To me, this has always been self-evident. A chair does not move unless someone moves it. Neither does your physical body, which is composed of much the same materials, move unless you will move it. Walking across the room is a magical operation. From the viewpoint of magic, no death, no illness, no misfortune, accident, war, or riot is accidental. And so basically he's saying that the music of his own day is essentially the point you're making, that modern day music has, for better or for worse, reverted back to essentially primitive shamanism.
Well, this is something that I was also in my video on the history of classical music. I cannot remember the name of the person who was putting forward this thesis, but it was somebody who was on Millennial Woes, who was basically outlining a theory that I think is attributed to Oswald Spengler of the traditionalist school, which says that things started out very simple, and that this represented some kind of primal traditionalism, and that as things became more intellectualized and became more modern, that the complexification of music in conjunction with the complexification of society, and I suppose maybe the atomization of different lines going off in different directions is seen as having some kind of analogy with or being an analog to atomization in society, which is something that reactionaries like to complain about. And that this furthermore is even intensified further in modern society because of the plethora of genres, and that this represents further complexification and further atomization of different genres. But my problem with this is, of course, that it's like comparing apples and oranges, because on the one hand, you're pointing to these complex pieces in the Renaissance and the Baroque and saying that that is over complexification. And then you are comparing that to a number of genres as opposed to a number of lines in the modern period, and saying that this represents a movement in the same direction. Of course, the problem with this is that complexification in terms of a piece being more intellectually intense is not obviously comparable to having a plethora of different styles. But an even more pointed reason why this thesis, I think, falls flat on its face is, of course, that the different styles within this modern plethora of genres are actually moving back toward the more primitive monophonic forms of music. And thus, I think that if you really are looking at the thing by comparing apples to apples, a more honest thesis and a more obvious thesis is that rather intellectualization of music accompanies the height of civilization, that music peaks in terms of its intellectual achievement along with other forms of art with the development of society, and that we are moving towards a more primitive society in some aspects of our culture, at least. And this is why the music is becoming more simplistic. But of course, the reactionary feels the need to defend primitivism, and therefore bizarrely ends up attributing intellectualization to modern primitivism in order to explain how it relates to modernity.
Well, exactly. And I would tend to agree with your overall thesis that, say, from the Greeks and the Romans up through the medieval and Renaissance eras into the Baroque, classical, and Romantic eras, music is gradually, much like Western literature, becoming more sophisticated and complex in its form and its structure and in the content that it's expressing. And you see that even as late as the early 20th century, full on, epic orchestral productions were still being produced. You had Gustav Mahler in before the Great War, where he produced, the Symphony of 1,000, his 1 through 9 symphonies. It's like listening to something that was written 100 years earlier. Especially since, a mere decade after Mahler, you got jazz and ragtime and the rise of popular music. And I think this is interesting, right? Because you're talking about how music becomes simpler, how it's less complicated. And I think one of the things, at least, okay, well, this is a twofold question, because in the United States, it's a little different. But in Europe, really, World War I, as it did for so many things, sort of sapped the life out of Europe. And the music you see being produced in Europe after 1914, there just aren't these complicated, epic, booming musical pieces anymore. Instead, you have dissonance and noise. I mean, in the Soviet Union, I mean, you still have, your Khachaturians and your Rachmaninoffs who were trained in the Tsarist era, but they had the music of the factory. They literally just recorded the factory. It was ridiculous. And we saw it in Western Europe. It's not quite as debased, but it's bad. Now, in the United States, we never really had a high classical music culture. Most of it we just appropriated from Europe. Now, there were some composers who are, quote, classical, like Copland and Gershwin, and they're good, but, they're not like a Beethoven or a Bach. So the United States, I think, was less likely than Europe in general to have that kind of music because it was a less aristocratic society, and that kind of music tends to be associated with aristocratic societies. And in Europe, we saw the decline of this music with the decline of aristocratic societies after World War I. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm trying to perhaps you could, if you had intended to ask a question, perhaps you could help me formulate what the question would be.
Sure. Well, it sort of evolved into a question, but the question is this. I think, one, do you think the United States developed a different musical culture than Europe in the sense that it didn't develop the same kind of classical geniuses like a Beethoven or a Mozart or a Bach or a Handel? One. And then two, the decline of European music and the fact that the United States never even reached that level was in fact in part due to the fact that Europe largely ceased to be aristocratic after the Great War. And aristocracies tend to produce this music, and the United States never really had an aristocratic class at all.
Right. Well, I do think that this is something that I was trying to get at in the roundtable that we had yesterday, in that I think it's possible for things to go in two different directions at the same time. So it may be that in some respect, a culture is, let's say, still developing the civilizational direction of its music. It is still moving in, it is still, you might say, enjoying the development of its artistic accomplishments, even while in other respects or in other adjacent cultures, there is already a sign of decline. So it's possible for, say, if you look at some of the ways that classicism has expressed itself admirably in American popular culture, whether it be in video games of some varieties, or whether it be in like some film scores, like if you think of John Williams, for example, that it may be that much of the classical potential in America is actually still developing, or was still developing until recently, and actually had an expression in popular culture, even while it was declining in Europe, or even while other aspects of American popular culture were indicative of a decline. So I think that these threads of rise and decline kind of run into one another, and I don't really know if it can be neatly divided into epochs of development or anti-development. And so I think that America is a latecomer to the classical scene, but I actually think that, and this is one of the reasons that I can really look down on a certain type of American elitist, or just Western elitist in general, is that that some of the great innovations, or if not innovations, at least developments in, you might say, not just classical music, but the whole classical atmosphere in general, is in things like films or video games or film scores, or in things like virtual choirs. That is, you might not have the best composers in history, but you have some of the best classical performances. Like if you listen to the Tallis Scholars, I'm sure that they're performing Bird or Tallis or Palestrina better than any way that it was performed in the actual era of Tallis or Bird or Palestrina. You have all of these great classical works basically played, performed, and recorded at a premium level, and that are all just available at the click of a button. You have different moods and colors that weren't expressed in past classical expressions. In, like, if you think of something like the video game Skyrim, which I never played, but I know people who did, and I've looked in on it. And I mean, the idea that you could have this kind of virtual reality where you can sort of, venture into all of these just unimaginable vistas, and listen to what is basically good classical music. The great irony, of course, is that the people who consider themselves to be so creme de la creme are the people who talk about how much they love jazz, but are the same type of people who look down on video games and popular culture, where that may actually be where the actual momentum of the classical ethos is. It's certainly not in jazz music that these symphony attenders listen to so that they can be sophisticated and at the same time show approval of things that involve Black people. I think that you have to kind of look for American classical development in unfairly deemed pedestrian avenues, like popular culture, such as in video games or film scores.
I actually do agree with both points, that the classical music culture the United States has created has led to some of the best compositions and recordings of classic works we've ever seen. And as to video games, I wholeheartedly agree. I don't know if you've played the game, but anybody who's heard of it should at least play it once. Relic's 1999 game, Homeworld. It's basically it's basically a space version of Israel finding its homeland. But the music, it opens up with a version of Barbara's Adagios for strings, which is amazing. And then the music, the ambient music throughout the entire game it's celestial. It's amazing. And yeah, it's a game that should be much better known, not just for the gameplay, but for the aesthetic qualities that the creators put into it. And I do agree that in the same way that, jazz was considered pedestrian and common back 100 years ago, and the hoity-toity types look down on it, video games are in the same category today.
Well, I mean, this reminds me, I don't really, I probably don't have as much firsthand experience with video games as you do, just because I think people just tend in the direction of different hobbies, but I certainly have some experience with them. And one experience I do have is more indirect. It's that I like to listen to video game ambience music, which is often accompanied by, say, pictures of architecture, and it creates this whole sensation. So if you look at an instance where I'm doing work, let's say I'm doing academic work, or I'm working on something for my channel, or I'm just doing something as simple as cleaning, and I can have this background on for free with the click of a button, where there's some kind of classical music that's composed for a certain ambient aesthetic of, you know, outdoors activity or something, and the two are layered on top of one another, and then there's an image, and then you can play that in the background and have a mood for what you're doing. Well, that is, as far as I'm concerned, nothing but snobbery would lead you to think that that is anything other than basically a classical highbrow experience. It's certainly much more, I think, transcendent than somebody who is like instead putting on like a scratchy vinyl recording of some jazz music because they think that it's like just approved of as being upper crust by the high officially approved of high culture, and because they also think it's politically correct. I think that that, you know, it may just require some open-mindedness to actually realize the extent to which in some ways there are greater opportunities for certain kinds of classical experiences that go beyond music that wouldn't have even really occurred to Bach or Beethoven. And this gets back to what I was saying a moment ago, where there is indeed this the possibility of development in different directions. Sure, in some ways we may see signs of decline, but in other cases we see both the residue of civilization and civilizational culture, and in other instances we actually see still developing themes of high culture. And this also relates back to our conversation with Master Sanders about the Star Wars prequels in the early 2000s. And I really think that what a kind of reasonably wholesome image of the future is one that does look forward to not a reactionary primitivism, nor to a kind of left liberal decadence, which is based on the most crass elements of pop culture, which is a kind of primitivism unto itself, nor to a kind of fake elitist, vinyl classical music plus jazz plus community symphonies ethos, but rather I think that some of our most wholesome sociological hopes and expectations and projection are really oriented towards this kind of future possibility of classical developments, that is of a society that's actually able to maintain a decent standard of living and is able to develop things like good musical recordings and the integration of certain classical themes into the pop culture. And I really think that this sort of hidden presence of classicism is emblematic of what modernity could be in the future if we manage to rescue it from all of these most unfortunate counter influences.
Exactly. Well, there's a couple ways I want to go with this. The first thing is this idea, and I think you're hitting on it, is that the current popular culture that we have now, that either is extremely dumbed down or glorifies the most deviant elements of society, is not the sign of a developing, progressing society, contrary to what these elements think. And if we could get back on, if we could course correct and get back on where we left off with, say, Mahler and Holst in 1910, we could move in a direction that's much more, as you said, wholesome. I think the other thing too, that's also an interesting thing to think about, is if we look at the real beginning of this complexification, if you will, of music in the Renaissance, um, many of these early composers come from Italy and Germany. And I wonder to what extent you would attribute that creativity to the fact that they were competing kingdoms and city states rather than a homogeneous kingdom. For example, it seems that Italy was far more fruitful musically than France was, for example.
Yeah, that's true. That's an interesting thesis that I haven't given that much thought to. I guess if you wanted to compare the extent to which that is the case, as a sort of a development that's independent of, say, genetic determinism, I guess you'd have to compare it to musical or cultural developments in other societies that also have decentralization. And maybe I'm not intellectually equipped to do that, but my feeling is that while this plays a role, that it doesn't seem to me that England was really all that decentralized in the same way that would apply to these other examples. Yet, contrary to what a lot of people believe, England actually does have an excellent history of classical music that definitely contributes.
Okay, it looks like we lost you, right, Ruminations. But yeah, another point to add is that Russia was a late bloomer in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was definitely the polar opposite of Renaissance Germany and Italy. So, competing political entities may not be the best explanation. But yeah, I think, right, Ruminations, you're gonna need to come back. I can't hear you. Well, it looks like we lost Right Ruminations. Hopefully he'll come back soon. But I guess one of the things. Oh, he's back. Here we go. Okay, Right Ruminations. How you doing?
Yes, sorry about that. I forgot to take the normal laptop cooling preparations. Anyhow, just to finish the point I was making, I would say that I think that there are examples cultures that have contributed just as much to the complexification that maybe are not that decentralized. So a good English example would be John Dunstable, who was actually writing at a much more complex level of composition in the 14th century, I think, than his continental counterparts at the time, who were still much more in the medieval era. And Dunstable is a kind of a proto-Renaissance figure. And also, I think that there are decentralist analogs, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, in the Asiatic world. Like in China, I think you find different levels of centralization at different times. And I just don't know of any non-Western example of music that really evolved in that direction. So I think I might be a little more deterministic than you with respect to my answer of this question.
I don't know if you heard it because you were having trouble with the computer, but one piece of counter evidence to my thesis would be Russia. 19th century Russia was very centralized, and yet it had this renaissance of musical and literary creativity. So it may not be directly correlated to forms of government at all. But would you say then aristocratic versus democratic? Europe tended to be more aristocratic up until 1920. And the United States has always been more democratic in general. Do you think that either of those has a factor in the development of this kind of music?
I mean, it does lend itself to it, because if you look at the United States, it is obviously, even though it had an aristocracy in the informal sense, let's not say an aristocracy, let's say a gentry of its own. It is obviously a more, to speak kind of a informally in colloquial terms, it's a more populist, libertarian type culture compared to, or let's say a more liberal, more classically liberal culture in some respects than what you have in Europe, which is this long-standing tradition, which has more time to develop, and also has a culture of patronage towards classical music that is facilitating its development. But at the same time, America starts to develop very quickly in that regard. As soon as it starts to develop its own kind of equivalent of an aristocracy in the late 19th century with the Gilded Age, you basically find, it has its own modern idiosyncrasies, but with like Charles Ives, for example, and then with even better with the development of these film composers and gradual introduction of this into the popular culture, even in the midst of a culture that at the same time was becoming more populist, more democratic, more vulgar in a sense. You still find the ability to develop this music in American culture, whereas even in elitist non-Western societies, you might find some analogies, but it really, I don't know of any real equivalent of this in, say, Japan or China. So I really do. I'll have to sort of state it in code, because I don't want to be in violation of any kind of YouTube regulation, since they are rather obnoxious at the moment. But I highly suspect that it may be a let's say a kind of bio-Western reality that is to a certain extent present. And you find that this fits the pattern of other developments, right? So like people in Asia, for example, may be better, may even be more interested in aspects of Western culture, much in the way that they are interested in, say, Western technology and very good at adapting them. But they don't really seem to have any point of original origin with respect to these highly developed systems of music. And there's something that I see you've brought up in the private chat, which is a decent counter thesis to what I've been articulating, that it could be that this music development owes a lot to Christianity. And I have to say, as a Roman Catholic, I am given to that particular kind of apologetics, considering much of the best art in history originates with the Roman Catholic Church, and then with Protestant traditions that grow out of the Roman Catholic Church. And I suppose one might say that such a robust system of that such a robust musical environment did not evolve in, say, the pagan cultures of the West. So there might be something even more compelling about the thesis that Christianity is the real determining factor in enabling a culture to be so original in developing these highly complex musical endeavors. It certainly does correlate with certain biological considerations, but then again, so does Christianity and its origins or perhaps not origins, but you might say the more intense development of Christian culture also correlates with certain genetic realities. So perhaps it is more due to the theological influence than the biological one. Who knows?
Yeah, as far as cause and effect with music, I'm more of a sociologist than a musicologist, but it does seem though that let me put it this way. I don't think it's an accident that the politically fragmented nations of Germany and Italy in the Renaissance led the way in this musical development. Eventually, the torch might have been passed to Russia or to Prussia or to England itself, but I mean, just like I said, I don't think it's an accident that it happened there first.
Yeah, but the reason I have a difficulty with this is because I contest this with respect to England, because although England is not always ahead of the curve, in many cases, there are certain endeavors, like with the example of John Dunstable, where it is England that is driving towards certain Renaissance or proto-Renaissance developments that in a way that puts them decidedly ahead of the continent. And another thing I will say that is in favor of the basically racialist explanation is that, well, in Eastern Christianity and in, you might say, non-European Christianity, you don't really find the same momentum of artistic development that you do in European proper. So that is also another thing to consider. But then one might also object to my saying this by saying, but yes, but then again, neither did Western Europe before Christianity came along. So it's probably a puzzle that can never be conclusively unwound. However, I think that we can say that non-Western, non-Christian societies have never been at the forefront of this development.
That is true. And if some highly educated or wealthy family from Japan or from China or from Saudi Arabia wants their children to learn music, they have them play Bach and Mozart. So, it doesn't go the other way. Sophisticated Western families with their children don't have them learn traditional Chinese and Japanese music for whatever, value they have. The global consensus is, and this is the thing that's interesting too, it's a global consensus. Western music from around 1500 to 1900, everybody recognizes is the best.
Yeah, I think that Japan, in particular Japan, but Asian people in general, have great taste in cultures and peoples.
Yeah, they do. And let's see. Yeah, but your theory, I find it odd that this guy on Millennial Woes, back to the beginning, is that he would argue that somehow simplicity was superior, because I don't think this is a alt-right consideration across the board. So, for example, someone like Richard Spencer, who wants a more Roman Empire type feel, one in space apparently, that would definitely need to be a very complex, sophisticated society, in which case simplicity in music would not necessarily be something to be desired. And certainly someone like, well, at least to my knowledge, Greg Johnson would also have, I don't think he'd share that opinion either. Was this like a niche opinion, or have you found anybody else with more cred who's advocated that too?
No, this is a reactionary position. So it's something that is also echoed in Evola, where he just dismisses Renaissance art out of hand and says that it is that it doesn't matter, that its beauty is sort of superficial and its artistic technical prowess is superficial, because what really matters is this kind of intuitive beauty or esoteric beauty inherent in the more ritualistic structures of traditional ancient societies. And this person was not just saying that the theory was theirs. They were, as I mentioned, they were echoing Oswald Spengler. And it's something that even will appear in people like Richard Spencer or millennial woes, just not consistently, because yes, they talk about they want to get into space, but then they also talk about how they think it would be good to have a poorer society where people were more on the edge and were more Ubermenschian, as it were. Like, I even think you find this in Nietzsche's Dionysian spirit that wants to emphasize the destructive as opposed to the creative, and of the idea of the sort of like the primordial. That the primordial is a source of excellence as opposed to that which they look down on as being comfortable and too comfortably bourgeois. But what I have a problem with this is that you're never going to have, if the Ubermensch or if the ideal man or the traditional man is something that is predicated on these frankly inferior circumstances, then he's not much of an Ubermensch, because you'll never be actually able to beat like a prosperous society with high technology and a booming economy and nuclear weapons. So that's also a contradiction that I actually do think is not misattributed to Nietzsche. If you look at the way Nietzsche talks about, I've been reading Genealogy of Morals. I'm reading that at the moment. And it seems to me that, I mean, if you look at the kind of conditions in which the Ubermensch is supposed to manifest himself, the irony is that they are circumstances which would basically predispose the culture to being the victim of every culture that is willing to accept the conditions of modern development and science and artistic complexification. So there's always this inherent contradiction in this idea of a kind of strongman traditionalism that I've never really seen adequately explained by the traditionalists themselves. It's like they think that they can somehow conquer space while at the same time maintaining a circumstance of poverty and primitive development. It's actually quite bizarre.
It is. But I sort of think we've covered most of what we set out to. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap this up?
Just like to re-emphasize that point, that I think that one of the things that did make the early 2000s such a great period of popular culture, like if you look at the Harry Potter movies or the Lord of the Rings movies or the Star Wars prequels and many others, and even in movies that I don't really like that much, that they do have this decidedly not only classical music element, but cultural themes in general, like in terms of the architecture, the clothing, and so forth. And I think that that idea of picking up where we left off and of sociological optimism is something that is part and parcel with the further integration of a kind of modern or postmodern classicism into the popular culture. And I think that that's a much healthier place to in which to project our hopes and ambitions than in these various other anti-modern divergences.
Well, that's a very good note to end on. And ending on that note, thanks again, Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.